Ezra Callahan's boots made the only sound on the wooden porch, a rhythmic creak that had become as familiar as his own heartbeat. 20 years of the same routine: wake before dawn, check the fence lines, tend the small herd of cattle that barely justified calling this place a working ranch, return to the house as the sun set over the endless Texas plains. 20 years of silence broken only by wind, cattle lowing in the distance, and the occasional coyote chorus under star-filled skies. The ranch house stood 30 miles from the nearest town of Del Rio, a 2-day ride that Ezra made only when supplies ran critically low. The structure itself was solid, thick limestone walls that kept the interior cool during brutal summers and warm during the rare cold snaps of winter. But it felt too large for one man. 4 rooms that once held the promise of family now echoed with absence. Ezra had stopped going into 2 of them years ago, keeping the doors closed like sealed tombs. He was 52 years old, though the mirror suggested older. His face had been carved by sun and wind into something resembling the limestone cliffs that dotted the landscape. Gray streaked through his brown hair and beard. His hands, calloused and scarred, moved with the efficiency of someone who'd learned to do everything alone. Talk to yourself too much out here, he'd decided long ago, and you'd go mad. So he'd chosen silence instead, letting the land speak its own language of rustling grass and distant thunder. Margaret had been gone 20 years this coming September. Cholera, the doctor from Del Rio had said, though he'd arrived 3 days too late to do anything but confirm what Ezra already knew. She'd been 31, full of plans for expanding the ranch, for the children they'd hoped to have, for a future that died with her in the back bedroom on a sweltering August night. Ezra had buried her on the hill overlooking the creek, under a cottonwood tree she'd loved. He visited the grave every Sunday without fail, though he'd stopped speaking to her after the first year. What was there left to say? The routine kept him sane. Morning coffee black and strong. Check the cattle. Mend whatever fence section had been damaged by weather or wandering wildlife. Noon meal of beans and cornbread. Afternoon work, splitting wood, maintaining the barn, cleaning tack. Evening meal, usually the same as noon. Sleep. Repeat. The sameness was comforting in its predictability. No surprises, no disappointments, no losses. Just the steady march of days turning into weeks, turning into years. This particular afternoon in late July found Ezra replacing boards on the barn's west wall. The summer heat pressed down like a physical weight, and sweat darkened his shirt despite the shade. He'd just positioned a new plank, when movement in his peripheral vision made him pause. A figure was approaching from the east on foot, moving slowly across the shimmering heat waves that made the distant landscape waver like a mirage. Ezra set down his hammer and wiped his face with a bandana, watching the figure resolve into clearer detail as it drew closer. A woman, he realized, which was unusual. Most travelers on foot through this country were men, drifters, prospectors, or cowboys between jobs. She wore a long dark skirt and white blouse, a wide-brimmed hat shading her face, and carried a small bundle over one shoulder. Her pace was steady, but showed the strain of someone who'd been walking in the heat for hours. He met her at the property line, his hand resting on the fence rail, but not moving to open the gate. Years of solitude had taught him caution around unexpected visitors. "Ma'am," he said, his voice coming out rougher than intended from disuse, "you're a long way from anywhere. Are you lost?" The woman stopped on the other side of the fence, and as she looked up, Ezra saw she was younger than he'd first thought, maybe 25, with dark eyes and skin tanned deep by the Texas sun. Her face showed both exhaustion and determination. "Mr. Callahan?" Her voice carried a slight accent he couldn't quite place. "Ezra Callahan." He tensed immediately. Nobody out here knew his name, unless they'd come specifically looking for him, and people looking for him usually meant complications he didn't want. "Depends on who's asking and why," he said carefully. The woman adjusted her bundle and met his gaze directly. "My name is Rosa Mendoza. I've come a very long way to find you. My grandmother sent me with a message about a debt that needs settling." Ezra's mind raced through possibilities. He didn't owe money to anyone. He barely interacted with people enough to incur debts of any kind. "I don't know any Mendoza family, and I don't owe anyone anything." "You've got the wrong man." But even as he said it, something flickered in the back of his memory. A name, a face, something from before Margaret died, before the 20 years of silence began. Rosa reached into her bundle and pulled out something wrapped in faded cloth. She unwrapped it carefully, revealing a small carved wooden horse no bigger than her palm. The craftsmanship was exquisite, every detail of mane and tail and muscle rendered with obvious skill and care. Ezra's breath caught in his throat. He knew that horse. He'd watched it being carved 23 years ago, sitting around a campfire with a group of Apache traders who'd stopped at the ranch to water their horses and rest before continuing their journey. "Where did you get that?" His voice came out barely above a whisper. Rosa wrapped the horse back up and returned it to her bundle. "My grandmother was there that night. She was just a child then, traveling with her father and uncle. You gave them water, food, and shelter when other ranchers had turned them away. Her father carved this horse as payment, but you refused payment. You said hospitality shouldn't have a price, that all people deserved kindness regardless of who they were or where they came from." The memory flooded back now with crystalline clarity. It had been spring before the heat of summer had truly set in. A small group of Apache travelers, peaceful and polite, asking only for water and permission to camp near the creek for one night. Margaret had insisted they share dinner, had brought out extra blankets when the night turned cold. The older man, whose name Ezra could no longer remember, had indeed carved that little horse, working by firelight with hands that moved like they were dancing. "That was a long time ago," Ezra said, his voice tight. "Your grandmother sent you all this way just to return a wooden horse." Rosa shook her head. "The horse is proof that I'm telling the truth. My grandmother is dying, Mr. Callahan. Before she passes, she wants to fulfill a promise her father made to you that night. He told you if you ever needed help, if you ever faced trouble you couldn't handle alone, you could call on his family and they would come. He said the Apache remember debts of kindness, that such debts are sacred." She paused, studying his face. "But my grandmother says you're the one who needs help now, even if you don't know it yet. She sent me to tell you that the spirits are coming." Ezra almost laughed at the absurdity. "Spirits? Ma'am, I appreciate you traveling all this way, but I don't believe in spirits or prophecies or any of that, and I don't need help. I'm doing just fine on my own." But Rosa didn't move from the fence line. "She didn't mean ghost spirits, Mr. Callahan. She meant the living ghosts, people from your past carrying unfinished business. She saw it in a dream 3 weeks ago. She saw strangers coming to your door, bringing questions about things you've tried to forget, and she saw that if you face them alone, with your heart still closed from 20 years of grief, you'll lose more than just your solitude. You'll lose your chance at peace." The words struck deeper than Ezra wanted to admit. He opened his mouth to send her away, to return to his comfortable isolation, but something stopped him. Maybe it was the memory of Margaret's voice insisting they help those Apache travelers. Maybe it was the recognition that 20 years of silence hadn't brought him peace, only numbness. Or maybe it was the simple human need for connection that he'd been denying for 2 decades. "It's too hot to be standing in the sun arguing about prophecies," he heard himself say. "Come inside. I'll get you water and you can rest before heading back to wherever you came from." Rosa smiled slightly and opened the gate. As she walked past him toward the house, Ezra felt something shift in the air. Not supernatural, but significant nonetheless. The routine that had sustained him for 20 years suddenly felt fragile, like a dam with the first hairline crack appearing in its face. And somewhere in the distance, thunder rumbled despite the cloudless sky, as if the land itself was acknowledging that change was coming whether Ezra Callahan was ready for it or not. Rosa sat at Ezra's kitchen table, drinking water from a tin cup, with the careful sips of someone who'd learned not to waste a single drop. Ezra busied himself at the stove, heating beans and slicing bread from the loaf he'd baked 3 days prior. The simple act of preparing food for another person felt strange after so many years of cooking only for himself. His movements were awkward, uncertain, like he'd forgotten the choreography of hospitality. "How far did you walk?" he asked, breaking the silence that had stretched between them since they'd entered the house. Rosa set down the cup and flexed her feet beneath the table. "From San Carlos, 3 days on foot. I had a horse, but she went lame near the Pecos River. I had to leave her with a family there and continue walking." She said it matter-of-factly, without complaint, as if 3 days walking through brutal Texas summer heat was simply what the situation required. Ezra placed a plate of beans and bread in front of her, then sat down across the table with his own portion. He watched as she ate with the practiced efficiency of someone accustomed to physical labor and irregular meals. Questions piled up in his mind, but he wasn't sure which ones to ask, or whether asking would invite complications he wasn't prepared to handle. Rosa finished eating and looked up at him with those steady, dark eyes. "You're wondering if I'm crazy," she said simply. "Walking 3 days to warn a stranger about vague prophecies and living ghosts. I understand. I wondered the same thing when my grandmother first told me about her dream." She pushed the empty plate aside. "But my grandmother has never been wrong about such things. When I was 12, she dreamed of a flood 3 weeks before the Pecos overflowed its banks and destroyed half of San Carlos. When I was 17, she dreamed my brother would be injured working the cattle drive. He broke his leg 2 weeks later, exactly as she'd seen." Ezra wanted to dismiss it as coincidence or selective memory, but something in Rosa's voice stopped him. This wasn't superstition or manipulation. This was a woman reporting facts as she understood them, whether he chose to believe or not. "Even if your grandmother's dreams are accurate," he said carefully, "I still don't understand what unfinished business could find me here. I've lived alone for 20 years. I don't have disputes with neighbors because I don't have neighbors. I don't owe debts. I don't have family left to complicate matters. Whatever your grandmother saw, she must have seen someone else's future." Before Rosa could respond, the sound of hoofbeats echoed across the property. Both of them turned toward the window, where dust rose in the distance, signaling approaching riders. Ezra stood, moving to the door with the wariness of someone unaccustomed to multiple visitors in a single day, let alone a single decade. Through the window he counted 3 horses, 3 riders, all men. They weren't riding with the casual pace of travelers seeking directions. They rode with purpose. Rosa joined him at the window, and he noticed her expression had shifted from tired calm to something more alert, more concerned. "Do you know them?" he asked. She shook her head. "But my grandmother said they would come in 3s. She saw 3 figures in her dream carrying questions about the past." A chill ran down Ezra's spine despite the heat. He stepped onto the porch as the riders approached, his hand instinctively checking that his rifle leaned against the doorframe within easy reach. The 3 men dismounted, at the fence line with the careful movements of people who'd spent long hours in the saddle. The one in front was tall and broad-shouldered, maybe 40 years old, with a face weathered by outdoor work and piercing blue eyes that assessed everything with quick efficiency. The 2 behind him were younger, brothers Ezra guessed from their similar features, both in their mid-20s with the nervous energy of men spoiling for confrontation. "Ezra Callahan," the tall man called out, his voice carrying the flat vowels of someone raised further north, maybe Kansas or Nebraska. "That's right," Ezra replied, keeping his tone neutral. "What can I do for you, gentlemen?" The tall man opened the gate without asking permission and walked through, his companions following. Ezra's jaw tightened at the presumption, but he held his ground on the porch. "Name's Thomas Brennan. These are my sons, James and William." He stopped at the base of the porch steps, looking up at Ezra with an expression that mixed determination and something that might have been old pain. "We've ridden a long way to ask you some questions about events that happened 23 years ago. Questions about my brother, Daniel Brennan, and what really happened the night he died." The name hit Ezra like a physical blow. Daniel Brennan. He hadn't heard that name spoken aloud in over 2 decades, had actively avoided thinking about it, had buried it under years of routine and deliberate forgetting. His face must have shown recognition, because Thomas nodded grimly. "So you do remember. Good. That'll make this conversation simpler." Ezra's mind raced backward through time, pulling up memories he'd deliberately left in the dark. Daniel Brennan had been a young cowboy, maybe 21 or 22, working a cattle drive that had passed through this region in the spring of 1866. There had been an accident. A horse had spooked during a thunderstorm. Daniel had been thrown, had struck his head on a rock. Ezra and Margaret had found him the next morning, unconscious and badly injured, abandoned by a trail boss who decided that one injured cowboy wasn't worth delaying the entire drive. They'd brought Daniel to the ranch, tried to care for him, but the head injury had been too severe. He died 3 days later, never regaining consciousness. Ezra had buried him on the property, next to where Margaret's grave would eventually rest. He'd sent word to the cattle company about what had happened, but had never received a response. Had never known if Daniel had family who'd been notified or who'd cared. "Your brother died from injuries he sustained in an accident," Ezra said quietly. "We tried to help him, tried to save him, but the damage was too severe. I'm sorry for your loss, but I don't understand what questions you think I can answer after all this time." Thomas's expression hardened. "The questions aren't about how he died. They're about what happened to everything he was carrying. Daniel had 3 months' wages on him, nearly $200 in gold coins, payment for a successful drive to Kansas. He also had our mother's wedding ring, which he'd been planning to give to a girl in San Antonio. When we finally got word about his death 2 years later and came looking, we found his grave but nothing else. No personal effects, no money, no ring. Just a wooden cross and a story about an accident. The accusation hung in the air like gun smoke." Ezra felt anger rising in his chest, hot and righteous. "Are you suggesting I stole from a dying man?" His voice came out low and dangerous. "Your brother arrived here with nothing but the clothes on his back and the injuries that killed him. If he had money or valuables, they were long gone before we found him. Maybe taken by whoever decided he was too much trouble to help and left him for dead in the first place." James, the older son, stepped forward aggressively. "That's convenient. No witnesses except you and your wife, and she's been dead for 20 years. No way to verify your story. Just your word that you're innocent, and our uncle somehow lost everything he owned before you found him." Ezra's hand moved toward the rifle, but Rosa's voice cut through the tension from the doorway behind him. "There were other witnesses," she said clearly. "Apache travelers who camped near here that same week. My grandmother was among them. Just a child at the time, but she remembers. She remembers a young cowboy being brought to this ranch, remembers Mr. Callahan and his wife trying desperately to save him. She remembers them burying him with respect when he died. And she remembers the trail boss who'd abandoned that cowboy, stopping at their camp 2 days earlier, drunk and boasting about how he'd pocketed the dead cowboy's wages, since dead men didn't need money." The Brennans turned to stare at Rosa with expressions ranging from surprise to suspicion. Thomas recovered first. "And where is this grandmother now? Can she testify to what she saw?" Rosa met his gaze steadily. "She's in San Carlos, dying. But she sent me here with her testimony, and with a message for you, Mr. Brennan. She says your brother's spirit has been restless, not because of Mr. Callahan, but because you've spent 23 years blaming the wrong man. The person who stole from your brother was named Silas Fletcher, the trail boss who left him to die. And if you want justice for Daniel, you should be looking for Fletcher, not harassing a man who tried to help." Ezra stared at Rosa in amazement. He'd never known about the trail boss's name or what had happened to Daniel's belongings. But it made terrible sense. A man cruel enough to abandon an injured worker would certainly be capable of theft. Thomas Brennan's face worked through a series of emotions: doubt, anger, hope, confusion. Finally, he looked back at Ezra. "Silas Fletcher. You know that name?" Ezra shook his head. "I never met the man. The cattle drive had already moved on by the time we found your brother. But I remember Daniel mumbling a name in his delirium, something that sounded like Fletcher or Fletch. At the time, I thought he might have been talking about a friend. I never connected it to the person who might have robbed him." William, the younger son, spoke for the first time, his voice less aggressive than his brother's. "If what she's saying is true, we've been chasing the wrong man for 3 weeks. Pa, maybe we should—" Thomas held up a hand, silencing his son. He studied Ezra's face for a long moment, then Rosa's, as if trying to read truth in their expressions. "You say your grandmother remembers all this clearly after 23 years. Rosa nodded. "She remembers because she saw Mr. and Mrs. Callahan show your brother more kindness in 3 days than he'd probably received in his entire life. She remembers because it taught her that some people are worth trusting, even when everything else says otherwise. That's why she sent me here, to make sure you didn't harm a good man while the guilty one went free." Thomas's shoulders sagged slightly, years of misdirected anger visibly draining from his frame. "Where would we find this Fletcher now?" "Last my grandmother heard, he was running a supply depot near Fort Stockton, grown fat on money he'd stolen from cowboys over the years. But that was 5 years ago. He could be anywhere now." Rosa crossed her arms. "The question is whether you want truth or just someone to blame." Because those are different things. The Brennan family exchanged glances, some silent communication passing between father and sons. Finally, Thomas nodded slowly. "We'll ride for Fort Stockton, ask questions, see what we can learn about Fletcher. And Mr. Callahan—" He paused, seeming to struggle with words. "I apologize for the accusations. We've been carrying this for a long time, and maybe we let the weight of it bend our judgment." Ezra nodded stiffly, accepting the apology, though the tension still coiled in his muscles. The Brennans mounted their horses, but before they rode away, Thomas turned back one final time. "If we find Fletcher, if we find proof he stole from Daniel, would you be willing to testify to what you know? About finding my brother? About hearing that name?" Ezra considered, then nodded. "If it helps bring truth to light, yes." After the Brennans disappeared into the distance, Ezra sank onto the porch steps, suddenly exhausted. Rosa sat beside him, and they watched the dust settle in the afternoon heat. "Your grandmother saw this," Ezra said finally. "She saw them coming, saw the confrontation?" Rosa nodded. "She saw more than that. She saw 2 more groups of visitors before the week is out. 2 more pieces of unfinished business, finding their way to your door. The spirits, the living ghosts, they're all coming now, Mr. Callahan. 20 years of isolation is ending, whether you're ready or not." Ezra looked at the horizon, at the vast emptiness that had been his refuge and his prison. He thought about Margaret's grave on the hill, about Daniel Brennan's grave beside it, about all the lives that had touched his own and left marks he'd tried to ignore. "Maybe," he said quietly, "isolation was never the answer. Maybe I've just been hiding from the fact that we're all connected, whether we want to be or not. And maybe your grandmother's spirits are here to remind me of that." Rosa smiled slightly. "She would say that's exactly right. The question now is what you'll do with that knowledge." As the sun began its descent toward evening, painting the Texas sky in shades of orange and red, Ezra realized he had no idea what came next. But for the first time in 20 years, uncertainty didn't feel like something to avoid. Today it felt like possibility. Dangerous, uncomfortable, but alive in a way his routine had never been. 2 days passed in strange domestic routine. Rosa stayed, helping with ranch work despite Ezra's protests that she should rest before her journey home. She mended fences with surprising skill, cooked meals that actually had flavor, and filled the silence with stories about San Carlos and her grandmother's wisdom. Ezra found himself talking more than he had in years, the rust gradually wearing off his voice. On the 3rd morning, Rosa was kneading bread dough when she stopped abruptly, her hands stilling. "They're coming," she said quietly. Ezra looked up from his coffee. "Who?" But she just pointed toward the eastern horizon, where a wagon appeared, moving slowly across the prairie. As it drew closer, he could make out 2 figures, a woman driving and a young girl beside her. The wagon stopped at the fence, and the woman climbed down with difficulty, one hand supporting her swollen belly. She was maybe 35, with auburn hair pulled back severely and a face lined by hardship. The girl, no more than 10, stayed in the wagon seat, watching everything with intelligent brown eyes. "Mr. Callahan?" the woman called. "My name is Catherine Shaw. I need to speak with you about something important." Ezra approached cautiously. "Ma'am, if you're in trouble or need help, I'm happy to provide what I can, but—" Catherine cut him off. "I'm not here for charity. I'm here because my late husband, on his deathbed 6 months ago, told me something I need to verify. He said 21 years ago, before we married, he worked on this ranch for a season. He said your wife Margaret was pregnant when he left, and that the child might have been his." The words struck like lightning. Ezra's vision narrowed, his breath catching in his chest. "That's a lie," he managed. We never—" But Catherine was already pulling papers from her bag. "My husband said they had a brief affair during a particularly difficult time in your marriage. He said when he left, he didn't know if she was carrying his child or yours, but he gave her this." She held up a silver locket. "He said if a child was born and if it survived, Margaret would have kept this locket as proof." Ezra's world tilted. He remembered that locket. Margaret had worn it the last years of her life, had been buried with it. He'd assumed it was something from her own family, had never thought to question it. "Margaret died of cholera," he said roughly. "She was never pregnant. There was no child." Catherine's expression shifted to something like pity. "Mr. Callahan, My husband died believing there might be a daughter out there. His daughter. I need to know the truth for his memory and for my own children's sake. Rosa stepped forward from the porch. Mr. Callahan, perhaps we should invite Mrs. Shaw inside to discuss this properly. The sun is hot and she's clearly with child. Her calm voice pulled Ezra back from the edge of panic. He nodded numbly and opened the gate. Inside the house, Catherine explained that her husband, Robert Shaw, had worked as a ranch hand here in the spring of 1868. He'd left suddenly in June, moved to San Antonio, and married Catherine the following year. He never forgot Margaret, Catherine said, her voice tight. He always wondered what happened, whether there had been consequences to their indiscretion. On his deathbed, he made me promise to find out, to make amends if there was a child who needed support. Ezra sat heavily in his chair, 20 years of certainty crumbling around him. He remembered Robert Shaw vaguely, a quiet young man who'd worked hard and left without explanation. He remembered that summer as particularly tense between him and Margaret, remembered arguments about loneliness and the isolation of ranch life. Even if what your husband said was true, Ezra said slowly, Margaret died without giving birth. There was no child, but Rosa was looking at him with an expression of deep compassion. Mr. Callahan, are you certain? Could Margaret have been pregnant when she fell ill? Could the cholera have taken both her and an unborn child before you realized? The question opened a door Ezra had kept locked for 2 decades. He thought back to that terrible August, to Margaret's increasing illness, to the doctor arriving too late. Could there have been signs he'd missed? Catherine leaned forward. My husband's guilt consumed him. If there's even a possibility, I need to know. I need to visit Margaret's grave to put his spirit to rest. Ezra stood abruptly. The grave is on the hill. I'll take you there. As they walked up the slope to where the cottonwood tree stood, Ezra felt the weight of uncertainty crushing down on him. Everything he'd believed about his marriage, about Margaret's faithfulness, about the life they'd built together, suddenly felt questionable. At the grave, Catherine knelt and placed wildflowers on the weathered wooden marker. She whispered something Ezra couldn't hear, then stood and turned to him. Thank you for letting me come here. Whether or not there was a child, whether or not my husband's confession was true, Margaret deserves peace. And so do you, Mr. Callahan. As the wagon disappeared back across the prairie, Ezra stood at Margaret's grave, more lost than he'd been in 20 years. Rosa joined him silently. Your grandmother saw this too? He asked. Rosa nodded. She saw your certainty being shaken. She saw you needing to confront the possibility that the past might not be what you thought it was. Ezra looked at the grave, at the cottonwood's leaves rustling in the wind. How many more truths am I going to have to face? Rosa touched his arm gently. One more group is coming. And then perhaps you'll finally be free. Ezra didn't sleep that night. He lay on his bedroll staring at the ceiling beams, his mind cycling through memories he'd polished smooth over 20 years, now suddenly jagged and sharp with new questions. Had Margaret been unfaithful? Had she been pregnant when she died? Had his entire understanding of their life together been built on foundations of ignorance or willful blindness? By dawn, he was exhausted, but no closer to answers. Rosa found him at Margaret's grave as the sun rose, sitting with his back against the cottonwood tree. She didn't speak, just sat beside him in companionable silence until he was ready to talk. I keep trying to remember that last year, he said finally. Trying to find signs I might have missed. But memory is a liar, isn't it? It shows you what you want to see, hides what you're not ready to face. Memory is complicated, Rosa agreed. But so is truth. Maybe your wife was faithful, and Robert Shaw was mistaken or lying. Maybe something happened that both of them regretted. Maybe the truth is somewhere in between. Does it change what you need to do now? Ezra looked at her confused. What do I need to do? Rosa met his gaze steadily. You need to forgive her. Whether she betrayed you or not, whether there was a child or not, you need to let go of the anger and hurt you've been carrying. That's what's kept you isolated all these years. Not her death, but your inability to process the loss. Before Ezra could respond, Rosa's attention shifted to the horizon. They're here. The last ones. Ezra followed her gaze and saw a single rider approaching, moving at an easy pace. As the figure drew closer, he realized it was a young woman, maybe 20 years old, riding a paint horse with confidence. She wore practical riding clothes and a wide-brimmed hat. And something about the set of her shoulders, the way she sat the saddle, struck him as familiar, though he couldn't say why. The young woman dismounted at the fence and removed her hat, revealing dark auburn hair pulled back in a braid. Her face was sun-browned and angular, with high cheekbones and a determined jaw. But it was her eyes that made Ezra's breath catch. They were the exact shade of grey-green that Margaret's had been, distinctive and unmistakable. "Mr. Callahan." Her voice was clear and direct. "My name is Sarah Whitmore. I believe you knew my mother." Ezra's legs felt suddenly unsteady. Rosa moved to his side, a steadying presence. "Who was your mother?" he managed to ask, though some part of him already knew the answer. Sarah's expression was carefully neutral, but he could see tension in the way she held herself. "Margaret O'Donnell before she married you. Margaret Callahan when she died." The world seemed to tilt and resettle into an entirely new configuration. "That's not possible," Ezra said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Margaret died without children." "We had no children." Sarah reached into her saddlebag and pulled out a folded document, walking to the fence to hand it through the rails. "This is my birth certificate. Born August 15, 1868 in Del Rio, Texas. Mother Margaret Callahan. Father unknown." Ezra's hands shook as he unfolded the paper. The words swam before his eyes, but the essential facts were clear. August 15th, 3 weeks before Margaret had died. "The doctor," Ezra whispered. "The doctor who came from Del Rio. He said Margaret had cholera, that there was nothing to be done." Sarah nodded. "The doctor's name was Henry Whitmore. He and his wife Martha couldn't have children of their own. When my mother gave birth in his clinic, she was already desperately ill. She knew she was dying. Dr. Whitmore told me that Margaret begged them to take me, to raise me away from here, to never tell you I existed." The revelation hit like a physical blow. Ezra sank to his knees, the paper still clutched in his hands. "Why? Why would she do that?" Sarah's carefully maintained composure cracked slightly, her voice thick with emotion. "Because she wasn't sure you were my father. Because she'd made a terrible mistake with Robert Shaw, and couldn't bear the thought of you raising another man's child. Because she was terrified and sick and dying, and she thought she was protecting you from more pain." Rosa knelt beside Ezra, her hand on his shoulder. "This is the final spirit," she said softly. "This is the living ghost your grandmother saw, the daughter who should have been his, coming to find the truth about where she came from." Sarah climbed over the fence, no longer willing to maintain the barrier between them. She stood a few feet away, and Ezra looked up at her through tears he hadn't shed in 20 years. "Tell me," he said roughly. "Tell me everything." Sarah sat down on the grass and her story spilled out. Dr. Whitmore and his wife had raised her as their own daughter, given her education and opportunities, loved her genuinely. But when Martha Whitmore died 2 years ago, Henry had finally told Sarah the truth on his own deathbed last month, that she wasn't their biological daughter, that her birth mother had died the same day she was born, that there was a man in West Texas who might be her father and deserved to know she existed. "Dr. Whitmore kept my mother's locket," Sarah said, pulling it from her pocket. The silver caught the morning light. "He said she wore it always, that it was given to her by a man named Robert Shaw. But he also said that when Margaret held me, in those few minutes before she died, she whispered a name. She whispered Ezra. He thought I should know that. Should know that whatever mistakes she made, in the end, she was thinking of you." Ezra reached out with trembling hands, and Sarah placed the locket in his palm. He opened it and found 2 things inside, a lock of auburn hair and a tiny photograph of himself, taken years ago when photography was rare and precious. "She kept my picture," he breathed. "Even after everything, she kept it." Sarah wiped her eyes. "Dr. Whitmore said she loved you deeply, that the affair with Shaw was a moment of weakness, born from loneliness and fear, that she regretted it immediately. He said she died knowing she'd hurt you, but hoping somehow you'd understand." "I never knew," Ezra said, looking up at this young woman who carried Margaret's eyes, and perhaps his blood or perhaps another man's. "I never knew she was pregnant. I never knew she gave birth. I thought cholera took her before—" He couldn't finish. Sarah moved closer. "Do you hate her?" "For what she did, for giving me away, for keeping secrets." Ezra looked at her, really looked at her, and saw not betrayal or deception, but a scared young woman seeking connection to her origins. He saw resilience and courage in the way she'd ridden alone across dangerous country to find answers. "No," he said finally. "I don't hate her. I'm angry and hurt and confused, but underneath all that, I still love her. And I'm grateful she gave you to people who could raise you properly, who could give you a life I might not have been able to provide." He paused, studying Sarah's face. "The question is whether you want anything from me. Whether knowing where you came from is enough, or whether you want—" He couldn't quite say it, couldn't presume. Sarah smiled through her tears. "I want to know my father. Whether that's you biologically or not. You were the man my mother loved. You're the reason she fought to give me life, even as she was dying. That makes you important, makes you family in the ways that matter." She hesitated. "If you're willing, I'd like to visit sometimes. I'd like to know about Margaret, about this place, about the man who lived alone for 20 years carrying grief he didn't even fully understand." Ezra stood, and without thinking he pulled Sarah into an embrace. She was stiff for a moment, then relaxed into it, and they stood there under the cottonwood tree, a widowed cowboy and the daughter he never knew he had, connected by loss and love and the complicated truth of the past. Rosa watched from a respectful distance, tears running down her own cheeks. When they finally separated, Ezra looked at both women, Rosa, who had brought him warnings and wisdom, and Sarah, who had brought him truth and possibility. "Your grandmother was right," he said to Rosa. "The spirits came and they shook everything loose. But maybe that was necessary. Maybe I needed to have everything I believed challenged so I could finally start building something real." Sarah touched his arm gently. "Dr. Whitmore left me his house in Del Rio and some money. I'm planning to start a horse ranch, breeding and training. I could use advice from someone who knows this country, who understands what it takes to survive here." She looked at him hopefully. "That is, if you'd be willing to help. If you'd want to be part of my life going forward." Ezra felt something crack open in his chest, not breaking but blooming, like the first green shoot pushing through hard desert soil. "I'd like that," he said simply. "I'd like that very much." As the three of them walked back down the hill toward the ranch house, Ezra realized that the isolation he'd maintained for 20 years hadn't protected him from pain. It had just frozen him in it. These visitors, these living ghosts from the past, had forced him back into the messy, complicated, beautiful world of human connection. The future was uncertain. There would be hard conversations ahead, questions about paternity that might never be fully answered, grief that would take time to process. But for the first time since Margaret's death, Ezra felt the possibility of hope. Not the erasure of the past, but the chance to build something new from its ruins. And standing beside this daughter, he was just beginning to know, with Rosa's wisdom still echoing in his mind, he thought maybe that was enough. Maybe that was more than enough. 3 weeks had passed since Sarah's arrival, and the ranch had transformed in ways both visible and invisible. The most obvious change was the noise, voices calling across the property, laughter echoing from the barn, the sound of boots on the porch that weren't just Ezra's own. Sarah had insisted on staying to help with the late summer work, and Rosa had delayed her return to San Carlos, claiming her grandmother would understand the need to see this transformation through. Ezra found himself waking earlier now, not from habit, but from anticipation. Breakfast had become a communal affair, with Sarah cooking eggs, while Rosa made coffee strong enough to strip paint. They talked about everything and nothing, plans for Sarah's ranch, stories about Rosa's grandmother, memories of Margaret that Ezra had kept locked away for so long. They emerged dusty and tentative, like artifacts from an archaeological dig. One morning, as they sat on the porch watching the sun paint the eastern sky in shades of pink and gold, Sarah broached a subject they'd been circling for weeks. "I've been thinking about paternity," she said carefully. "About whether we could know for certain if you're my biological father or if Robert Shaw was." Ezra sipped his coffee, considering his words. "Would it change anything for you, knowing one way or the other?" Sarah was quiet for a moment. "I thought it would. When I first started this journey, I thought having that certainty would somehow make me feel more complete, more real. But now—" She gestured at the ranch, at the work they'd done together. "Now I think maybe family is about choice as much as blood. You've chosen to welcome me, to teach me about this land and about my mother. That matters more than what any test could tell us." Rosa, who'd been listening from the doorway, added her perspective. My grandmother would say that spirits don't follow bloodlines. They follow love and intention. The fact that Margaret thought of you in her last moments, Mr. Callahan, that means something regardless of biology. Ezra felt warmth spread through his chest. I've been thinking about it too, he admitted. And I realized that for 20 years, I lived with absolute certainty about the past. That certainty made me feel safe, but it also made me rigid, unable to adapt or grow. Maybe uncertainty isn't something to fear. Maybe it's just space for possibility. The sound of approaching horses interrupted their philosophical discussion. All three of them stood, watching as a familiar wagon crested the hill. Thomas Brennan and his sons had returned. Ezra felt Sarah tense beside him, but he placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "It's all right," he said quietly. "I think this is good news." The Brennans looked different than they had 3 weeks ago, lighter somehow, as if a weight had been lifted from their shoulders. Thomas dismounted with a broad smile that transformed his weathered face. "Mr. Callahan, we found him. We found Silas Fletcher." The words tumbled out with obvious satisfaction. "He was running a supply depot near Fort Stockton, just like the lady said. And when we confronted him about Daniel, about the money and the ring he tried to run, that told us everything we needed to know." James, the older son, picked up the story. The local marshal got involved, searched Fletcher's property, found a strongbox full of items he'd stolen over the years, including our mother's ring. "He kept it all these years like trophies," William added. "Fletcher confessed to everything. Said he'd been robbing injured or dead cowboys for decades. Figured nobody would miss them or trace it back to him. Your brother Daniel wasn't his first victim, Mr. Callahan, and he wouldn't have been his last if we hadn't stopped him." Thomas pulled a small object from his pocket, a gold ring with a delicate engraving. "This was my mother's. Daniel was carrying it the day he died. Thanks to you and Miss Mendoza, we finally have it back. And more importantly, we have the truth." Ezra felt vindication mixed with sadness. "I'm glad you found justice for your brother. He deserved better than what happened to him." Thomas nodded solemnly. "We came back to apologize properly and to thank you. We also wanted you to know that we've arranged for a proper headstone for Daniel's grave, if you'll permit it. Something more permanent than a wooden cross, something that will last." Ezra glanced at the hill where Margaret and Daniel rested. "I think that would be appropriate. Your brother deserves to be remembered." After the Brennans left, promising to return in a month with the stonemason, Sarah turned to Ezra with curiosity. "There's another grave up there?" "Besides my mother's." Ezra nodded. "Daniel Brennan. He died here before Margaret did. I buried him on the hill because it seemed like the right thing to do. Give him a resting place with a view of the land, rather than some anonymous hole in the ground." He paused. "I guess I've been a caretaker of other people's ghosts for a long time. Maybe that's part of why I couldn't let go of my own." Rosa touched his arm gently. "But you're letting go now. Can't you feel it? The house doesn't hold ghosts anymore, it holds people. Living people with futures ahead of them." She was right, Ezra realized. The ranch no longer felt like a mausoleum, where he performed the same rituals day after day. It felt alive, messy, complicated, and full of potential. That evening they received one more visitor, a rider bearing a letter from San Carlos. Rosa opened it with trembling hands, read quickly, and tears began streaming down her face. "My grandmother," she whispered. "She passed 2 days ago, peacefully in her sleep." The letter continued with words from other family members, describing how the old woman had seemed at peace in her final days, how she'd spoken often of her granddaughter's journey, and the spirits she'd been sent to guide. Sarah immediately moved to Rosa's side, offering comfort. Ezra found himself doing the same, this small act of communal grief, feeling natural in a way that would have been impossible just weeks ago. "She knew," Rosa said through her tears. "She knew this would happen while I was gone. She sent me here anyway because she believed this was more important. She believed you needed help, Mr. Callahan, and that helping you would teach me something essential about life and loss and healing." Ezra felt his own eyes filling. "Your grandmother was a wise woman, and she was right. I did need help, even though I didn't know it. I needed to be pulled out of my isolation, forced to confront the past, reminded that life continues even after loss." They held a small ceremony the next day on the hill, adding a circle of stones near Margaret's grave to honor Rosa's grandmother. Sarah spoke words about the interconnectedness of lives, about how one person's wisdom could ripple across time and distance to touch people they'd never met. Rosa added prayers in Spanish and Apache, languages her grandmother had taught her, honoring both sides of her heritage. Ezra simply stood silent, feeling the weight of gratitude for a woman he'd never known, who'd nonetheless changed his life completely. A week later, Rosa prepared to return to San Carlos for her grandmother's funeral and to settle family affairs. Sarah would accompany her partway, before continuing to Del Rio to begin work on her horse ranch. The morning of their departure, the three of them stood by the fence where it had all begun, where Rosa had first arrived with her warnings about spirits and living ghosts. "What will you do now?" Sarah asked Ezra. "Will you stay here alone again?" Ezra looked at the ranch, at the repaired fences, the cleaned barn, the house that no longer felt empty even though he'd soon be its only occupant. "I'll stay," he said, "but not the way I stayed before. I'll keep working the land, but I'll also ride to Del Rio regularly to help you with your ranch. I'll maintain the graves on the hill, but I'll also make sure I'm part of the living world, not just a caretaker for the dead." He smiled. "Your grandmother taught me that isolation isn't safety. It's just a different kind of death." Rosa embraced him warmly. She would be happy to know her last act of wisdom bore such fruit. "And Mr. Callahan, remember, the spirits came not to haunt you but to free you. Honor that gift by staying free." Sarah hugged him next, holding on a moment longer. "I'll write every week," she promised, "and I expect you to visit often. This may be where I came from, but you're family now. That's not something I'm willing to lose." As Ezra watched them ride away, he didn't feel the familiar pull of loneliness that had defined his existence for 20 years. Instead, he felt connection to Sarah's future, to Rosa's family, to the memory of Margaret not as a perfect saint, but as a complicated woman who'd made mistakes and loved deeply. He felt connected to the Brennan family and their quest for justice, to Daniel sleeping on the hill, to the Apache travelers who'd shown kindness decades ago, and whose granddaughter had returned that kindness when he needed it most. That evening, Ezra did something he hadn't done in years. He opened the doors to the 2 rooms he'd kept closed since Margaret's death. One had been meant as a nursery, the other a guest room. Now he cleaned them thoroughly, opened the windows to let fresh air chase away the mustiness of abandonment. These rooms would be ready for Sarah when she visited, for Rosa if she returned, for whoever else might need shelter or rest, or simply a place to belong. He spent the next weeks in motion, riding to neighboring ranches he'd avoided for decades, reintroducing himself to communities he'd withdrawn from, offering help where it was needed, and accepting help in return. He discovered that the world hadn't forgotten him despite his long absence, that people were willing to welcome back a man who'd finally chosen to rejoin the living. He found himself laughing more, talking more, engaging with life rather than simply surviving it. When the stonemason arrived with Thomas Brennan to install Daniel's headstone, Ezra was there to help. The stone was simple but dignified. Daniel Brennan, 1845-1866, beloved brother, died far from home but not alone. Beside it, Ezra commissioned a second stone for Margaret's grave, replacing the weathered wooden marker with granite that would last generations. Margaret O'Donnell Callahan, 1837-1868, beloved wife and mother, forever remembered. Sarah arrived for the unveiling, and together they stood on the hill as the sun set, painting the sky in brilliant colors that seemed to celebrate rather than mourn. "Do you think she knows?" Sarah asked quietly. "That I found you, that we found each other?" Ezra considered the question seriously. "I don't know if the dead know anything about what the living do, but I think the important thing is that we know. We know the truth, complicated as it is. We know we have each other. That's enough." As autumn approached and the brutal Texas heat began to ease, Ezra found himself transformed in ways both subtle and profound. The routine that had sustained him for 20 years had been replaced by something richer, a life built on connection rather than isolation, on acceptance rather than certainty, on hope rather than mere survival. The ghosts, both the literal graves on the hill and the metaphorical spirits that had come knocking, had done their work. One evening, sitting on the porch with a letter from Sarah in one hand and coffee in the other, Ezra realized something fundamental. He was no longer a widowed cowboy living alone. He was a father figure to a remarkable young woman, a friend to a family seeking justice, a grateful recipient of an old Apache woman's wisdom, and a man finally learning to forgive both the dead and himself for being imperfect and human. The spirits had indeed come knocking, and in opening his door to them he'd finally set himself free. The desert wind whispered across the prairie as stars emerged one by one in the darkening sky. Ezra sat in comfortable silence, no longer lonely, no longer hiding, simply present in his own life for the first time in decades. And somewhere on the hill beneath the cottonwood tree, he imagined Margaret at peace, knowing that the daughter she'd given away and the husband she'd left behind had finally found their way to each other. The past couldn't be changed, but its grip had finally loosened. And that, Ezra thought as he finished his coffee and prepared for tomorrow's work, was as close to redemption as any man could reasonably hope for.